Welcome back to the Chosen Few. Today, we're stepping onto a tiny limestone rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. It's 1942, and this island, Malta, is currently the most bombed place on the face of the earth. For 154 consecutive days, the sky has rained steel. The buildings have been ground into white dust. The food is gone, the fuel is dry, and the Axis powers are certain that surrender is just one more air raid away. But they were wrong. Malta wasn't just an island. It was the unsinkable aircraft carrier that stood between Hitler and the conquest of North Africa. Today, we're focusing on the two groups who paid the highest price to keep this fortress standing: the Royal Navy and the Maltese civilians. The interactive hook. But before we descend into the limestone shelters and the burning decks of the convoys, I have a challenge for you. For groups defended this rock: the Royal Navy, the British Army, the Royal Air Force, and the civilians. Only one of these groups suffered the least amount of fatalities during the siege. Who do you think it was? Take a second, drop your guess in the comments, and let's see if you can spot the statistical chosen few who beat the odds. To understand the Siege of Malta, you have to stop looking at the land and start looking at the water. By August 1942, Malta wasn't just a fortress, it was a cage. The island was weeks away from a target date. The day the food would run out and the white flag of surrender would have to be raised. There were no cookies, no luxuries, and barely enough potatoes to keep a child's stomach from cramping. The island needed a miracle, and that miracle had to come by sea. This was Operation Pedestal. The British dispatched a massive fleet, 14 merchant ships protected by a terrifyingly large escort of battleships, aircraft carriers, and destroyers. Their mission was simple but suicidal: get through the gap between Sicily and North Africa and reach the Grand Harbor. Among them was the most important ship of the war, the SS Ohio. She was an American-built tanker, loaned to the British, carrying 12,000 tons of fuel. If the Ohio sank, Malta died. The gauntlet. The Mediterranean was no longer a sea, it was a shooting gallery. Within hours of entering the danger zone, the carrier HMS Eagle was sent to the bottom by a U-boat. Then came the Stukas. The Luftwaffe fell from the sun in near-vertical dives, their sirens screaming. The Royal Navy gunners worked until their barrels turned red, creating a box of steel in the sky, but the sheer weight of the Axis attack was overwhelming. One by one, the merchant ships were picked off. Explosions turned the sea into a chaotic mess of oil and fire. The Ohio was hit. A torpedo tore a hole in her side. Then a Junkers 88 bomber, shot out of the sky by the tanker's own guns, crashed directly onto her deck. Then another. The Ohio was a burning wreck, her back was literally broken, and her engines finally gave up the ghost. She sat dead in the water, a massive target just 70 miles from Malta. The sandwich of steel. In the history of naval warfare, what happened next is almost unbelievable. The captain of the Ohio, Dudley Mason, refused to quit, and the Royal Navy refused to leave him. Two destroyers, HMS Penn and HMS Ledbury, later joined by HMS Bramham, moved in. They didn't just escort her, they became her. In a maneuver that defied every rule of seamanship, the destroyers pulled up alongside the dying tanker. They used heavy wire cables to literally lash themselves to her sides. They sandwiched the Ohio between them, using their own engines to provide the momentum the tanker no longer had. Imagine the scene: 3 ships tied together, dragging a broken, sinking hull through a sea infested with E-boats and bombers. They were moving at a crawl, barely 5 knots. They were sitting ducks. The weight of the Ohio was so immense it started to pull the destroyer's inner hulls apart. The cables snapped repeatedly under the strain, and each time, under fire, the sailors had to resecure them. The miracle of Santa Maria. On August 15, 1942, the Feast of the Assumption, or Santa Maria, to the Maltese, the people gathered on the ancient bastions of the Grand Harbor. They had been starving for months. They were skeletons in rags. And then they saw it. Through the morning mist appeared a sight that remains legendary in naval history. A battered, black-streaked tanker, her decks nearly level with the water, being physically carried into the harbor by 2 straining destroyers. The Ohio was sinking even as she entered the mouth of the port. A pipe was immediately run from the shore to her tanks. They pumped the last of the fuel out just as her hull finally settled on the bottom of the harbor. The Royal Navy had paid the price. Of the 14 merchant ships that started the journey, only 5 made it. Hundreds of sailors were gone, swallowed by the Mediterranean. But the Ohio was in. The planes had fuel. The water pumps could run. Malta would live to fight another day. For the chosen few, on those destroyer decks, it wasn't about glory. It was about making sure the people on that rock had one more day of hope, and perhaps, eventually, a few more potatoes on their plates. If the Royal Navy was the pulse of Malta, the limestone was its skin. To be a civilian in Valletta or the Three Cities in 1942 was to live in a world of 2 colors: the blinding white of pulverized stone and the pitch black of the deep earth. When the Regia Aeronautica first appeared in 1940, the Maltese were caught in a terrifying middle ground. They were an ancient people with a history of resisting sieges, but they were living in 16th century stone houses that stood no chance against 500-pound modern explosives. As the Luftwaffe took over the campaign, the surface of the island became a lunar landscape. Entire neighborhoods were turned into a fine, choking white powder. If you walked the streets after a raid, you didn't look like a person. You looked like a ghost, coated from head to toe in the dust of your own home. But the Maltese had a secret weapon that Hitler's Air General Albert Kesselring couldn't bomb: the island's geology. Malta is essentially a massive block of Globigerina limestone, soft enough to cut with a hand saw, but strong enough to withstand a direct hit from above. As the sirens, known to the locals as Il Barija, wailed for the 10th time in a single day, the population didn't just run, they descended. What started as small basement cellars evolved into a massive, hand-dug subterranean civilization. People used picks, shovels, and their bare hands to gouge out miles of tunnels. In some places, they repurposed ancient Roman catacombs. In others, they moved into the disused tunnels of the old Malta Railway. Imagine living in a space no wider than a hallway, carved 30 feet under the street. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and the smoke from flickering oil lamps. Thousands of families lived, slept, and prayed in these rock-cut shelters for months on end. This wasn't just a place to hide, it was a community. There were underground chapels where priests celebrated Mass while the ground shook above them. There were underground schools, where children learned their lessons by candlelight to the muffled thud of high explosives. In the Blue Grotto and the caves of Rabat, babies were born into a world of shadow, never seeing the sun for the first weeks of their lives. But the greatest enemy wasn't the bombs. It was the silence of an empty stomach. The Victory Kitchens. By mid-1942, the blockade we discussed in segment 1 had brought the civilian population to the brink of extinction. The Victory Kitchens were established, communal soup stations where your daily ration was often a thin, watery broth. For the chosen few who survived those tunnels, food was the only currency that mattered. A single potato was more valuable than a gold watch. Families would guard a small sack of tubers as if it were a chest of jewels. There were no cookies, no sweets, and eventually no bread. People became so weak from malnutrition that they developed famine edema, their limbs swelling while their bodies withered. Yet, when the German planes dropped leaflets demanding surrender, the Maltese used them for toilet paper. They refused to break. The George Cross, the bravery of these civilians, the mothers who kept families together in the damp dark, the men who dug shelters until their hands bled, did not go unnoticed. On April 15, 1942, King George VI made a move that was unprecedented in the history of the British Empire. He awarded the George Cross to the entire fortress island of Malta. It wasn't a medal for a soldier or a general. It was a medal for the shopkeeper in Valletta, the farmer in Gozo, and the child in the limestone cave. It was an acknowledgement that the civilian population was just as much a part of the front line as the Spitfire pilots in the sky. When the bombs finally stopped falling, the people emerged from the caves to find their cities gone. But they had saved the unsinkable aircraft carrier, and they had done it by becoming one with the rock itself. By the end of 1942, the dust in the limestone caves began to settle. The arrival of the SS Ohio, battered, broken, but still afloat, had changed the chemistry of the Mediterranean. It wasn't just that the people finally had a few more potatoes and a gallon of kerosene. It was that the unsinkable aircraft carrier was back in the fight. With the fuel from the Ohio, the Royal Air Force's Spitfires could finally take to the skies in force, no longer having to ration every drop of petrol like it was liquid gold. But the real nightmare for the Axis came from under the waves. Malta's 10th submarine flotilla, known as the Shrimp Flotilla, was unleashed. Operating out of the bombed-out docks of Lazaretto, these crews lived in conditions nearly as cramped as the civilian shelters. They were the chosen few of the deep. They hunted Rommel's supply lines with a vengeance. Because Malta held out, 75% of the Axis supplies destined for North Africa were sent to the bottom of the sea. Field Marshal Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, later admitted that without those supplies, his campaign was doomed. Malta wasn't just defending itself anymore, it was winning the war in Africa. By 1943, the island transitioned from a target to a springboard, the base from which the Allies launched the invasion of Sicily. Now, let's go back to that question we asked at the beginning. We looked at the four groups who stood on the front lines of the Siege of Malta: the Royal Navy, the British Army, the Royal Air Force, and the civilians. Which group suffered the least amount of fatalities? If you guessed the Royal Air Force, you were right. Despite the legendary status of the pilots, the Faith, Hope, and Charity, biplanes, and the Spitfire Aces, the total number of RAF deaths during the siege was approximately 600. While their per capita risk was incredibly high, their total numbers were small compared to the thousands of sailors lost at sea or the soldiers guarding the perimeter. Here is how the grim tally breaks down. Royal Navy, 5,000 plus, the highest toll, mostly lost in the Highway to Hell convoys. Civilians, 1581, a testament to the safety of those limestone caves. British Army, 1,000 plus, mostly from the AA batteries and coastal defence. Royal Air Force, 600 plus, the smallest group, but the spearhead of the defence. The legacy of the Rock. The Siege of Malta officially ended in November 1942, but the scars remained for decades. The island had been hit with the equivalent of several Hiroshima-sized blasts in conventional explosives. Yet, the social fabric never tore. The lesson of Malta is a powerful one. It's a story of what happens when a population refuses to be a victim. They didn't have much, certainly no cookies, and barely enough potatoes to survive. But they had the rock. They had the limestone that shielded them, and they had the sailors who died by the thousands to make sure that shield never cracked. Today, if you visit Malta, you'll see the George Cross still flying proudly on their flag. It's a permanent reminder of the 154 days of fire, the silence of the caves, and the broken tanker that saved a nation. Because in the end, it wasn't just the planes or the ships that won the Battle of Malta. It was the grit of the people who stayed when everyone else told them to run. So like we do every episode, I invite you to join us in a moment of reflection. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.